this part of the conversation is going to be very open-ended. We're going to begin with Peter Harrison, and at some point we'll just invite all of you to jump in. So yes.
I actually wanted to sort of make some comments. And
Please go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
We wanted to have a fireside chat, but as you can see, there's no fire. There's no comfortable chair, so it's a bit of a linear, discursive, it looks like, setup. But I did want to try to break that open. So let me start with a three-body problem. Because the way we set it up was science and religion, but we heard a lot about morality driving the questions of science. And so I wonder, and this is a question, open-ended question I would like to ask both Peter and Marilynne, to what extent do you think it is really more a science and morality problem than a science and religion problem? And I'd be very curious to see what you say about that. And then in terms of religion, because in this Hall of Angels, we need to bring that in, the higher spheres in a way. I have a question for Marilynne about grace and for Peter about sin. I thought that would be appropriate. Why do I get to sin? Let's begin with sin then. Let's begin with sin. So what I really remember as one of having read most of your books, what I really like very much is in, I think, The Fall of Adam and the Rise of the Modern Sciences or something along those terms, that you say that the Augustinian model, which was marked by original sin, was very positive for the development of science because it allowed for a kind of trial and error attitude that would work very well for a modern science. So I'm interested in your notion to what extent sin, which seems to be a problem, can actually be an aid in the development of modern science. I'm sort of interested in your take on that. And let me just ask Marilynne about grace, because you did talk about grace from time to time, but it was just sprinkled in there kind of in your talk. So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about grace, and maybe especially in a concept that you mentioned that I'd never really thought about, but found immediately very sort of fertile. And that's a notion you talked about, apophatic science. Is apophatic science a grace science, or does grace have any connection with apophatic science? That would be my question to you. So maybe, Peter, you'll start with...
So you want to start with the first one about morals and science?
Yes, that would be great. And then, yeah.
So look, I think on that one, part of my story is that when we start with these categories, science and religion, which are historically constructed, the various relations that fall out are functions of those historical constructions. So in answer to your question, I'd be reluctant to replace those with an alternative set of problematic constructions. But I think, but I'm very sympathetic to the thrust of the question, which is, and I'd say rather values perhaps, which is, I know, equally problematic to morals. But I do think that fundamentally, if we're going to be reductionistic about it, many apparent disputes between science and religion turn out to be about fundamental value commitments. And that's not merely at the level of the things in the cartoon, but for scientists about the epistemic virtues, which is to say, what are the appropriate moral comportments of people in the knowledge quest, and what's the appropriate comportment for people who are religiously engaged. And I think part of the argument there is that there's an incompatibility, certainly for advocates of conflict. I think that ultimately that's what it boils down to. Okay. And that to some extent the doctrinal questions, whether it's evolution or whatever it is, are kind of epiphenomena of that deeper issue. So that's the short answer to that one. I'll come to sin when we've heard from...
Thank you. I think that we have to be alert to the fact that religion is very historically bounded, and that it is not reliable in terms of adjudicating questions of right and wrong. Again, looking back to the 19th century, because we perhaps have some view of that, these countries that dealt in the cruelest colonial behavior thought of themselves, I think, as quite pious, quite religiously centered, and part of their religious confidence was used by them to justify violence against people that were of other faiths or no faith. So I just, I think morals are absolutely important. I think that they never cease to be a new problem. I think that very often people fall back on moral conceptions that they learned at their mother's knee without pausing to think, about their mother's knee, So if there's a conflict between religion and science, look back to the old days of eugenics, when they were actually quite of one mind, religion and science, and we have denied or repented the consequences of that idea for a long time. So we've all got to be careful all the time and do new thinking all the time, because we can't rely on even what is presented to us as religion as keeping us on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on this with a slight shift in perspective. So when Peter speaks about value systems and thinking about the way in which religion and science are associated with specific value systems, I think there's a slightly different way of thinking about values or virtues, and of course those mean different things, but that don't presume at the outset the existence of a total system where you derive those values, right? So if you start with practice, a practice of inquiry or questioning, let's say, right? What are the kinds of virtues or the kinds of values that guide an inquiry? Of course, there are idealized versions of those things. There are normative conceptions of those things. But in practice, how is it that a physicist or a theologian or a layperson engages in questioning and so on? I think that might help us to get beyond a certain overly coherent or overly systematized or totalistic conception of values, and then it might also help us to get beyond the kind of problem of, okay, religion says this or science says this other thing, right? It would open up then the possibility for what Marilynne is saying of a more open-ended, perhaps a more exploratory, a more open, a more sort of creative openness to the different resources that are available to the inquirer, right? Rather than whatever, these already preset deterministic ideas.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just come back, I think that's exactly right, which is to say that there are different disciplinary formations in, say, the sciences versus the humanities, and that's entirely appropriate. And none of that has anything to do with some overarching commitment to some Kantian whatever and whatever. So I think that's entirely right. But there are still points at that level, I think, of potential conflict. If you take the comportment of the scientist, which is supposedly naturalistic in terms of the adoption for the purpose of the exercise of a methodological naturalism, and the difficulty, I think, is when that is assumed then to be a kind of universal frame that operates everywhere, and not one that you then leave at the laboratory door, and for other forms of knowledge you adopt a different kind of persona or set of virtues. And again, I think this is where I think Weber was mistaken in thinking that the sciences were in some sense morally neutral, and which is the point, because I don't think they are. And if you think they are, it actually hides a set of implicit commitments that come with the package. So I think it's important. So I think it's an excellent point, and we need to be conscious of what those commitments are and how far they will take us.
I think that, the human world is brilliantly constructed, so to speak. it's made so that all of us have consequence. All of us have to understand what is good, where meaning lies in the individual encounters that we have, whether they're large or small, you know. I have a favorite Puritan who says that we will be judged twice, once when we die, and a second time when every consequence of everything we have said and done has been realized. Now, when you think about that, you know, I mean, it's kind of hair-raising, but when you think about it from the point of view of, for example, slandering a group of people, you know, you may say something once, and it's repeated 5 times, and then it's repeated 25 times, and then it's, you know, the source of a civil war, you know. It's a way of understanding the potential importance of any one of us at any time. And I think that that kind of consciousness of moral responsibility is something that could be, you know, applied to any circumstance. A scientist knows best, has the best possibility, at least, of understanding potential consequence of what she or he does. You know, we defer to them because they are better judges than the laity. At the same time, that often they have not exercised judgment. You know.
John Flavel.
Yes, John Flavel, my angel.
Is that also why you called, I thought that was also very telling, you called the heroes of science also saints? Is that because, you know, as opposed to what Adrian was saying, the fight of science against priestcraft, there is a way in which scientists do religious work?
Well, you know, there is the truth. You know, and I mean, this is a difficult question, but no scientist is wanting to find something that is not true, you know? And that is a kind of intellectual discipline that, you know, certainly in its best forms, parallels very closely what a mystic might desire, you know? And think, I mean, Calvin says that you have to instruct yourself in science because it enhances your appreciation to celebrate God. Yeah. You know? True, right?
So now your answer on sin.
Sin.
Yeah.
I could talk for a long time about sin. Wilhelmine's unkindly asked me to summarise the contents of a 300-page book in what I hope will be. I hope we have time for you guys to participate soon. But look, yes. So I think paradoxically, in the early modern period, owing to the efforts of the Protestant reformers who put an Augustinian conception of original sin back on the agenda in a strong way, this has significant epistemological consequences. And the other part of the story, I think, is an Aristotelian natural philosophy that had flourished in the Middle Ages. And Aristotle has a conception that human beings are oriented towards knowledge, and on the teleological Aristotelian conception, there is a genuine object to the things to which we are naturally oriented. So line 1 of the metaphysics, all men by nature desire to know, therefore there must be a legitimate object, and our intellectual virtues order us to that object. And the scholastics bought into this to a large extent. But the complaint of Luther and Calvin is that Aristotle had not factored in the fall and original sin and the way in which that had disordered our desires and our capacity to arrive at truth. So in the historical story, Adam had an encyclopedic knowledge of the world. He lost that as a consequence of the fall. And that was part of the Bacon reference that I put up on the PowerPoint, that what we're attempting to do through the sciences is to re-establish that to some degree. And that provides a larger legitimating framework. But the specifics of how we do that, I think, are interesting. And the standard split that you hear about in Philosophy 101 between empiricists and rationalists is part of this story, because on the rationalist side, and there's a tendency to associate that, for that to be correlated with Catholicism, there's a disemphasis on the epistemic consequences of original sin, such that human reason gives us the capacity to access knowledge of the world. For those like Calvin and Luther and their followers who strongly emphasised the epistemic impacts of original sin, there's more involved. We can't rely on reason. We have to rely on trial and error. We have to rely on the cooperative activities of many individuals cumulatively over time. So you get a conception of science as a kind of makeshift enterprise that we engage in the seculum, but it has to be corporate, it has to be long-term, it has to look at little problems, it has to be trial and error, and it doesn't give us certainty. Now, it's not merely Pascal also has this because of his Jansenist sympathies, which are also strongly aligned with an Augustinianism. And Pascal has this wonderful expression where he says we are kind of caught between ultimate skepticism on the one hand and this assumption that we can access truth on the other. And he said the Greeks actually represent these two extremes, with the skeptics one and Aristotle on the other. And he said we're actually stuck in the middle. And there's a dynamic then that this sets up, that in this kind of dialectic where we're caught between a conception that we can actually access the truth and the realization of the fallenness of our capacities, science is what actually falls out of that as this trial and error, cumulative, cooperative attempt to arrive at truth. And Locke is explicit about this. We can't have genuine Aristotelian scientia in this life, he says. All we can do is put together bits and pieces, and so our empirical science is a makeshift science. Now, of course, that will then change in the 19th century when science can answer all the questions, but originally it's very modest. It's a very modest enterprise. So that's the short version.
Thank you.
The question is about sin?
Yeah.
Okay, sin. It's very strange. I mean, I think maybe something has gone wrong over the centuries in terms of our thinking about this, because the fall, as it's used, as it's a conceptually important idea for Descartes, say, is error. Okay? The fall creates error, And this is quite remote from the idea of sin as being the sort of the demonic inner self or something like that. I don't know. It's very interesting. I always, I go back to the idea of our obligation to other human beings as images of God, which is what Calvin does. He never lists what the sins are or anything like that, except by glossing the Ten Commandments. It's an important difference, because the idea of the capacity for error is liberating. Descartes says God would not lie to me, at the same time that he has incredible difficulty getting to what he can call truth, so that the dynamic between God and the actor is one of, yes, there is truth, yes, I am fallen, and the pursuit of truth goes through the path of error, part of our sacred relationship to God is the fact that we err. I think is much more important than the fact even that we sin. And sin being described as, of course, offenses against humankind and the earth.
Should we open it up to the audience? Yes. I think you will get a microphone.
Yes. I'm struggling a little bit with this vague and abstract word science. And I start to think about particular disciplines, say mycology or the study of fungus, or neurology or neuroscience, or macro or econometrics. And it's not clear at all to me what the common epistemic virtues are among them. And I think I would say the same thing about religion. So you have all these wild different practices and concepts that relate to each other in a fascinating array. And that creates different, depending on how you mix and match, you create opportunities or possibilities or reframing of the issues, right? I mean,
I just wanted to add something to what you said, which is even within distinctive traditions of scientific practice or religious practice, there are often tensions or conflicts between value commitments, right? So I'm thinking of, for instance, there's all these debates within kind of between Spiritist circles in the 19th century and their rivals or their antagonists. And part of that turns on different conceptions of what the scientific values should be, and part of that is about a kind of a conflict between the conservatism of science, its rule-boundedness, and then the other is the open-mindedness of scientists, right? With Spiritists arguing, no, we need to be open-minded. Perhaps we haven't discovered all the rules of the universe, and then their antagonists saying, well, no, we need to work within certain limits and rule out certain possibilities at the outset. So I'm agreeing with you, but I think it's also not just about different, say, disciplinary formations, but also even within formations, there are some choices that are made about what values to promote and what to downplay.
Yeah, I mean, I just say I completely agree with you, and this is it. That in other words, if you want to tell some story about the relations between science and religion, you would go, well, what science are you talking about, and what aspect of religion are you talking about? And what will follow from that is that there's no story about conflict or harmony, or those stories are likely to be wrong because they make these overgeneralizing moves. And I think your point is the point that Paul Feyerabend notoriously made. He said, you look at what's going on in the sciences and anything goes. Now, it doesn't mean that there's an irrational activity, but there's a plurality of approaches, and there's a common sense attitude to figuring out how you're going to solve the problem. And that varies according to the objects of your study. So yes, you're right. Absolutely right.
I would say, I mean, by my reckoning, 2 of the 3 sciences that you name are not sciences. Econometrics I would exclude, and I don't remember what the other one was. But they don't behave like sciences. They don't have the consequences of sciences. They, I think, can make great claims to their sobriety as disciplines by aligning themselves with science, but I think they need another word for themselves. And that the question of defining science would be much relieved by having certain of the more dubious claimants disallowed.
for us.
Wilderness.
This is a question actually inspired by the last talk. He talked just a couple 20 minutes ago. You mentioned about how I think Marxism, behaviorism, positivism, these are all instances of determinist movements in the 20th century. And my ears perked up a little bit at Marxism. I think I would class that one as the only political movement of the ones you mentioned. And it made me wonder, what would you say, or where would you gesture toward a politics that could help us avoid this extinction that would be at our own hands, as you say?
Well, frankly, I think that reinvestment of reverence and admiration in the human species would be a huge start. It's not our tendency to, like Marxism. I mean, I've read Capital. I know he's a large-hearted man with a good prose style. I mean, there is no Marxism in Capital. It's more like reading Dickens than it is like reading William Beveridge or somebody. But the tendency of Marxian, or whatever you want to call it, thought was to say that you belong to a certain class, you have a certain experience, you have certain inevitable behaviors. As a consequence of that, you are incapable of certain authentic loyalties, you are, et cetera, in other words, I mean, if you were to block out the Londoner on the street in Marxian terms, he would be a creature of the determinist assumptions, and of course the proletariat are very much created by their circumstance. I mean, really created as human beings, not as if he imagines them as individual people. So despite my admiration for him in many terms, I think he did have determinist implications finally, some of them deserved. And as far as we can do politically, let us be true to one another.
If I understand, I will expand it into a question for everyone. So the first is, are you asking for science to abandon the dishonesty of a position that does not account for the mystery of the observing and understanding subject?
Am I asking for what? I didn't hear the third word.
I'm sorry, I don't know if this is not working. Are you asking for science to abandon the dishonesty of a position that does not account for the mystery contained in the observing and understanding subject?
To abandon a position that does not entertain mystery, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
No, not by any means. I mean, as I said before, I think the fact that we have this world of, what they call local reality, local realism, it's there, it works, we're at home in it, it's real, but it is somehow categorically unlike a more profound stratum of being, which it cannot be separated from. I think that if you deal with the given world, the world of human experience, and you do so in light of the fact that it is part of a much larger system of being, from which it cannot reach by extrapolation, say, you'll be a better scientist. But this world is really interesting. And I think that it's the basis for kind of interpretation of the apophatic, it's not accidental, shall we say, that they are of one continuum of being.
Can you have the ethical without that mystery being factored in?
Can you have the ethical? I have known a lot of people in my life of all sorts of descriptions, and nothing about them predicts whether or not they're ethical, and so, I mean, ethics is beautiful, the ability of people to discipline their behavior in those terms, unenforced, out of a sense of integrity, is very beautiful. But I don't find that it is exclusively the product of any kind of background at all.
The background being a mystery.
Pardon?
Background being a mystery.
Well, the background, I mean, you meet all kinds of people, and it's the good fortune of this country that it's really possible to meet all kinds of people. And you conclude all sorts of things about them, but there is nothing predictable about who is ethical or who is moral. That is individuated in a lovely degree that one ought not to transgress against,
I guess I want to bring up the cliched figure of Galileo, who's been mentioned a couple of times today, because he was such a kind of iconic figure in the whole issue about science and religion ever since Galileo, basically. But he takes on that position beyond himself, I think, first through Milton in Areopagitica, maybe possibly John Wilkins slightly before that, but I think Milton more than anybody else. And then he echoes down through the encyclopedia, as you pointed out, on the 19th century contentions. And one of the things about the Galileo case, as it echoes down, is that it's not just about, as it were, the obscurantism and the self-importance and power-mongering of the Inquisition, but it also takes on a role as a kind of marker of the importance of freedom of expression for sciences and then more broadly for culture in general. And thinking about that, what I want to ask you about is the development of sort of levels of judgment and sieving and ring fencing and hierarchies, really, within the sciences themselves. Because as they've grown, so increasingly they've developed protocols for deciding who gets to speak and who gets to speak through which venues, how loud their voice is in the discipline. So the old image of Galileo in the old conflict model, where he represented sheer freedom of expression and one just spoke up in the way that Galileo did, and the truth would win. And it's kind of a Miltonic notion that you can't praise a cloistered virtue. That debatably, that's in the current sciences an inapplicable notion, because we've got to the point where the sciences as an enterprise are so massive, and they're so diverse, and the range of institutions is so great that the kind of myth of freedom of expression that exists there is at best highly mediated. And if I had to make a more concrete reference, a couple of weeks ago there was a conference at the Institute for the Formation of Knowledge here on science and liberalism, and Peter Gallison came from Harvard. Gallison's a historian of physics, and he was talking about the project that gave rise to the first photograph of a black hole a year or two ago. And this is one of these big physics projects with hundreds and hundreds of people involved in it from all over the place. And what they found, per Gallison's story, is they basically had to develop an internal constitution, which defined sort of hierarchies where almost voting would be done to decide who actually got to contribute opinions and how the decision was made about what the photograph actually was that was publicized of the black hole. It wasn't decided by nature. It was decided by a kind of deliberative democracy process. So I'm not sure exactly how to put this as a question, but I think it's something that emerges as a kind of notable asymmetry in discussions about science and religion, that we tend to think about religion as being full of all of these very mediated institutions, like the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and so forth. And we think of science, or the sciences in plural, as relatively kind of apolitical within themselves. But that's not the case, and it hasn't been the case for quite a long time. And you don't, as it were, speak freely without certain privileges within the sciences. And I just wonder what you think about how that, I think, social fact factors into how we might think about these questions about morality, the objectivity or otherwise of science, the relationship between science and religious communities, that kind of thing.
Now, yeah, I'll have a bit of a go at that, Adrian, and I wonder whether the construction of Galileo as the kind of the emblem of that speech is a bit of a red herring. I think Milton is actually a key figure, and Milton didn't visit Galileo and records how he visited him. Galileo, a prisoner of the Inquisition. This was his description. And there's actually an image of someone's done the picture of Milton visiting Galileo putatively in a dungeon, as opposed to a rather nice villa in Florence if you get the chance to visit. But anyway, that's another story. So there is this construction of Galileo as the hero, and part of that is that when he supposedly mutters under his breath when he's supposed to be, still it moves. It is the attribution to Luther of "Here I stand, I can do no other." And Luther is another figure who's constructed in this lineage, but that's another story. But Stephen, as you know, I think Stephen Schaffner tells the better story of the 17th century, which is it's to do with networks of trust. And so, although the Royal Society has this notion, and it's embodied in its motto, which is "Nullius in verba," which is from Horace, and literally, I'm not going to see into the authority of any master. Ironically, they're quoting a classical source for the individual. But anyway, but in fact, I think the reality is that there's an understanding of it as a collective enterprise, and already there's the building up of sets of protocols for who is trustworthy. That's if you buy the Chapin story, and which I do, I think. And for me, the interesting parallel is the fact that, to some extent, I think within the medieval Catholic Church, knowledge was similarly distributed on the basis of the conception of implicit faith, which is to say that the ecclesiastical authorities made determinations on questions of doctrine that the laity had no conception of the complexity of, but had implicit faith in the institution, that so that there was the trust and the knowledge was somehow distributed. And I think that actually maps across to the sciences, but there was such a strong reaction against implicit faith as a kind of Catholic epistemic failing that even though someone like Robert Boyle would say, people had to rely on implicit faith if they would accept what Galileo told them he saw through his telescope. So there is a recognition of that already, but I think the environment was such that the rhetoric was slightly different from the reality, and as I think ever since then, that the socially distributed, and your point, I think, is that now with these massive projects where you get 100, 1,000 scientific names on a paper, you've got this incredible distribution of expertise and knowledge, and you need even stronger protocols to make it work. But so that's just an initial reaction to.
I'm curious whether, as the kind of social fact that you describe, whether you're not also describing a process through which scientific communities have become increasingly systematized and regulated, and then the converse of that is that religious communities are increasingly fragmented and sort of desystematized. Yeah.
I mean, I think the difference is that one key difference is that there do seem to be mechanisms for arriving at scientific consensus, but in the religious sphere, no, right? And people might think, well, we've got one that's reliable and one that looks a bit dodgy, and that you can see that's a plausible interpretation if some focus on propositional knowledge is the aim of the game. Yeah.
I think that we have to remember that we're looking back on Galileo, having seen him be proved right. But, the Ptolemaic universe, it's like a cosmic joke. It sort of worked. It worked much better than it should have. And it was the leading scientific hypothesis and had been for hundreds of years, And so the fact that the rejection of it, even though Copernicus had already more or less familiarized the idea that Galileo proposes, it's not surprising to find that there was resistance, especially because the church had, in what must have been good faith, it had sponsored what was the leading scientific hypothesis of the time. There were things that went on in the church, like, scientific priests who tried to establish the day for Easter and so on would find that there were anomalies but it's also true that we can't look back and say they were so foolish and so wrong, because they were not foolish and they were wrong, but in such an amazing way,
Well, I mean, I'd put it even stronger. I think in scientific terms, they were right. And they were right because there was compelling scientific evidence against the motion of the Earth. And not only that, there was a third option between the Ptolemaic and the Copernican, which was the Tychonic, which satisfied most of the observations without the scientific difficulties of getting the Earth into motion that you'd get with parallax and what followed from that. That's another long story, but I agree with you completely. I think that there's the Catholic authorities were relying on the scientific consensus of the time, and they were not scientifically naive at all. Whether they should have condemned Galileo is the other question, and I think that was imprudent, to put it mildly, because now he's an icon of science-religion conflict. But not spot there.
Yes, please. Indeed.
Studied out, so I saw earlier one on like the variety within science and religion. So the case that I'm thinking of is after like 1950 or 1960s, quantum physicists suddenly found something called Buddhism, right? So, and they began to had a really good time for 20 or 30 years, and somehow one reason could be just Buddhism just didn't have this kind of tremendous burden within the Western tradition as Christianity and Catholicism have, which is what we've been talking about like today, right? Like Western science and Western religion had a pretty hard time for 200 years, put it to simplify it. But so in that case, alternative religion came in and sort of enabled this kind of unexpected dialogue between science and religion. So my question is, because we've been also talking about this kind of pluralism of science and religion today, right? So so it seems nowadays we're facing this many body problems of science religion, right? Not like binary problems the same in many cases. So I just wonder like how much you can comment on this kind of many body problems of science religion.
Acting. You were the quantum mechanics person.
I'm afraid I didn't hear you well enough to understand your question. I'm very sorry. I should have asked you to speak up. Can you give a very short and very loud version of what it was you wanted to ask?
Yeah, sorry. So the case that I was thinking, and
yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, so the case that I'm really lucky is during the 1960s. What is and quantum physicists to have really great conversations between one another for them a big block become there and our meta. So on that history suddenly enabled this kind of dialogue between science and religion, right? But it's not religion we think about in tradition. So my question is basically about man-body problems between multiple the two different output. I would say about scientific disciplines versus cultural religious traditions, like rather than within like specific single tradition of science and religion. And so I just want to learn in home costs.
Well, the question of religion is very profound. What is it, and what is meant by its varieties? I taught in a program that recruits writers from really any English-speaking country for the most part. And I was known as the religious person on the faculty, which was purely an accident of my writing about religion because there were other religious people on the faculty. They just kept their cards to their vest, But anyway, I was the religious professor. So if someone who was Hindu or Muslim was offended by the assumptions that people had about Hinduism or Islam, they would come to me and say, isn't that foolish? Is that so vulgar to misinterpret things in that way? I'd say, yes, you're right, because they were. But it became clear to me that under those circumstances, the fact that I engaged the conception of the universe as including God was a bond between them and we that meant they could talk to me. They always assumed that I would understand their objections or their questions. There is theism. There is and I know Buddhism doesn't claim to be a religion in the same sense that others are, and yet at the same time it opens on the universe in the way that religions do. Insofar as people can talk across lines with that being a mediating conception and so on, it seems one need not make an issue of the fact that it doesn't call itself a religion. I think that theism and quantum physics are very compatible. They're so compatible in my mind that I'm afraid to believe what I believe, But, I'm sure that this would be true in the same degree for many people that are in any way like-minded as far as a religious conception of being is concerned.
Yeah. Just a brief comment on that. There was a moment, and I'm thinking the 60s, the 1960s, where there was the Tao of physics and the dancing Wuling masters and the notion that Buddhism was somehow uniquely compatible with, say, quantum mechanics or conceptions of consciousness. And I'm a little bit dubious about that story, but I'm not an expert in it. But if you have a look at, I put Don Lopez's book, Don Lopez's Buddhism and Science, A Guide for the Complexed. He talks about the ways in which Buddhism has been constructed by the West in light of particular conceptions of science. And I find his story quite compelling, but I'd invite you to just take a look at that if you're interested in that line of thought.
Just another brief reference, How the Hippies Saved Physics by David Kaiser, where Deepak Chopra and the Tao of Physics, those folks appear, but in the very specific context of especially Bay Area physicists working outside of academic physics, because academic physics from the 50s onward, Kaiser argues, became much more concerned with calculation and with practical use than with the philosophical questions, the sorts of questions that Einstein and Bohr and so on were interested in. That's for the streaming, so we need that so that people online can also hear.
Okay, thank you. But I don't think we can just reduce this question to a constructivist understanding that, like, Buddhism is just, like we would say, Buddhism is a non-theistic. So I think there is a epistemic, I can't say that word, but there's a break between theistic folks and the non-theistic folks. That in Buddhism, it's just not so emphasis on a God, right? There could be in it, there could be no God. It just depends on like how useful you think that God is. So I think this like de-emphasizing God, I know this is not really a question, but a comment on that. And I will say, like, I am a Buddhist, so that's my contribution to this conversation too.
As we could maybe say that as we're drawing to a close, because we want to celebrate with a reception, I actually wonder if I could ask both of you to make a statement to the effect of where you see this go once we do leave the conflict thesis behind. Let's assume we can do that. What are the sort of vistas that you have where there would be a more positive interaction of science and religion?
Yes.
Yeah, both of you. By way of rounding off the discussion.
Look, I guess for me, part of the, and it goes partly to the point that you made, that once you understand the plurality of practices that count as science and the plurality of practices that count as religion, it's very difficult to make any kind of overarching claim about the future. So I think what that does, it certainly debunks the notion of a perennial conflict between science and religion, but it doesn't give you a platform to say, aha, and therefore we're going to look forward to a new age for complementarity of science and religion either, because the scientists are doing their own thing. And I mean, I think the religious traditions to some extent are more stable. And I think that this is another thing that's often left out of the picture. And you briefly alluded to it, Marilynne, when you said that theologians, not cautious enough on my account, but tend to be cautious about making claims about the relation of theology to some evanescent science that's constantly a moving target. And whether that's the case for quantum physics, and in fact the whole of, I suspect that physics looks from the outside to be somewhat in crisis, ready for a paradigmatic shift. And so, but that's typical of the nature of science. It changes as it goes on. And so if you put those two things together, science as a kind of enterprise that's constantly changing and on one account progressing, religious traditions as relatively stable but plural and totally different sets of disciplines in the science, all of this is a way of avoiding doing precisely what you've asked me to do. And, so I think what we can celebrate is leaving the conflict myth behind. And as a historian looking backwards, I'm quite happy to say that. As someone who doesn't classify myself as a prophet, I'm reluctant to say more.
You know, I do theology, read theology, think about theology, simply because it's one of the oldest habits that I have, you know? And since it's a more or less direct outgrowth of childhood almost, I think that my model for everything is of the pilgrim soul. The question, I mean, for me, I have great respect for science, and I felt it as a burden for as long as I believed that science precluded theology, religion. And then I felt it as a wonderful light thrown over science when it itself testified to the fact that it was much stranger, with more implications of freedom and possibility than I had ever understood from any previous version of it that I had taught to me, you know? So from the point of my own sort of interior monologue, something really quite beautiful has happened. I think whether people think about science in terms of what it implies, in terms of freedom, openness, change, all the rest of it, that will be the change that will occur, you know? I mean, we can't predict from this point because most people are still locked into what is a very partial view of reality, you know? So I'm very satisfied. I mean, aware of the fact that this is an imperfect physics, everyone is, it nevertheless transcends a more imperfect physics, a more incomplete physics, you know, which either means that it is highly satisfactory or that it's on the way to doing something more satisfactory. But for me, it's like what will come next? Well, maybe writing some new theology will come next. Maybe writing new commentaries on scripture will come next, you know, maybe new novels will come next.
Good place to end? I think so. Yeah. Thank you all.